It was a wretched January morning when the widow first appeared at our door, the sort of cold that freezes one's mustache before the second pipe, and fog so thick it seemed to have taken up residence in the hall. I had just returned from my rounds in Kensington, soaked through despite my umbrella, and was stamping the sleet from my boots, when I heard the sharp triple knock that always heralded a visitor, either too respite or too proper to wait for the knocker to fall again. On its own, Holmes, of course, had not moved from the hearth. Reclining on the sofa with his fingertips pressed together and his eyes half closed, he appeared as though he were in some trance, a curious state I had come to understand meant his thoughts were threading together, silently and at great speed. He made no indication he had heard the knock at all. I opened the door. She was tall. The woman, not young, but not quite past her prime, and dressed entirely in mourning. Not the fashionable sort. A modest veil and a small silver brooch in the shape of a weeping willow. There was something in her bearing, a certain angular pride, that made me straighten at once. "Mrs. Mallory," she said, her voice soft, refined, but edged. "I believe Mr. Holmes is expecting me." "He is?" I asked, before I could stop myself. "Come in." She stepped inside without hesitation, shaking the fog from her veil. "I sent a note 2 days ago," she said, "though I imagine Mr. Holmes does not always wait for the mail to confirm a case." At this, Holmes stirred from the sofa without rising. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Your husband's death was listed as natural causes," he said calmly. "Yet your solicitor received an unsigned envelope containing a torn page from his medical file, a page that suggested poisoning." Mrs. Mallory did not react with surprise, only a small, dignified nod. "So you did receive my letter?" Holmes finally stood. "Madam, I saw the item in the Times before your ink was dry." We sat, and the case unfolded in Holmes's preferred way, not through direct interrogation, but through patient, surgical questioning, always preceded by some bold deduction. "You were not present at the time of his death," he said, "though you claim he died in your arms." A flicker crossed her face, not guilt, but shame. "I lied to the doctor," she admitted. "I was in the garden. I found him collapsed in the study when I returned, but it sounded better to say I had been there with him." Holmes gave no judgment. "Because you were already afraid something unnatural had occurred." She looked at me, then back to Holmes. There had been signs. He grew paranoid, distracted. There were moments he didn't seem to know who I was. He began locking the door to his study, and then forgetting why he'd locked it. "Did he believe someone was watching him?" Holmes asked. Mrs. Mallory hesitated. "He would not say it, but yes." "Then," Holmes murmured, "we begin with the assumption that he was right." I could not help myself. "You think he was murdered?" Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "I think someone wanted it to look like he was not." The case, as she laid it out, was curious in the extreme. Dr. Sebastian Mallory, a once respected chemist turned recluse, had died of what was ruled to be a stroke, a conclusion supported by the attending physician, the constable, and the late doctor's own known history of high blood pressure. But 2 days after the funeral, Mrs. Mallory's solicitor received a torn page from the man's private records in an envelope with no return address. The document described an experiment involving trace compounds of belladonna and phosphorus, substances that in precise quantities could mimic the symptoms of natural death. "What does the rest of the document say?" Holmes asked. "Don't know." That was the only page in the envelope. Was anything missing from his study? "No," she said quickly, then paused. "At least, not that I can identify. His journals were all there, his letters. But I can't say whether he hid anything." Holmes reached for his violin and tapped the scroll against his palm. "You live at number 7, Draycott Lane." "Yes," he nodded. "Then we'll call on you this evening, but it will be dark. All the better." When she had gone, leaving behind only the faintest scent of rosewater and coal smoke, I turned to Holmes. "You don't suspect her?" He shook his head. "Her grief was real. But it's not the grief of a woman who fears a noose. It's the grief of someone who was used." I frowned. "Used how?" Holmes looked out the window, where the gaslight blurred into the fog like an oil stain. "That," he said, "is what we're about to find out." It was not until later that evening, as we stepped out into the dim drizzle of twilight, that I began to sense how different this case felt from others. There was a tension to Holmes's stride, not urgency, exactly, but a tautness, like a violin string tuned just past the pitch of comfort. He had spoken little since Mrs. Mallory's departure, which was often his habit when facts were percolating in that complex mind of his. But this silence felt colder, more surgical. "You already suspect something," I ventured, as we hailed a cab to Draycott Lane. "I suspect several things," Holmes said, "but it is suspicion without form, like a shadow cast without a body." The ride took us eastward, toward the older quarter of Chelsea, where the lanes narrowed and the houses grew older. Draycott Lane itself was a crooked little street of brown brick homes, their chimneys exhaling a lazy smoke into the night air. Number 7 had a low wrought-iron gate and a narrow garden path crowded with frost-bitten roses. Mrs. Mallory greeted us herself. She was no longer in morning dress, but wore a high-necked gown of navy wool. Modest and yet distinctly stylish, and her dark hair was pinned more tightly than before. I noticed she seemed thinner by candlelight, almost frail, as though the black of her clothes had earlier lent her a strength that now flickered like the lamps in the hallway. "His study is untouched," she said, leading us past a grandfather clock that ticked with unnerving slowness. I locked it after the doctor left. "The attending physician?" I asked. She nodded. "Dr. Altham. He's from the parish surgery. He's known Sebastian for years." "And what of servants?" Holmes asked, as we passed a parlor heavy with dust. "Just one, an elderly housemaid, Mrs. Rusk. She's nearly deaf and doesn't sleep in." Holmes gave no outward reaction, but I could tell he had mentally filed away the layout and social structure of the house already. Who could hear what? Who might have seen whom? And when? The study itself was a long, narrow room with 2 windows facing the garden and a large writing desk at the far end, littered with papers, books, and the long, extinguished remnants of a fireplace. A tall bookshelf lined one wall. A cabinet of locked drawers. The other. Holmes entered first and stood completely still, as if listening to the room's memory. "There," he said suddenly, pointing. "You've moved that rug." Mrs. Mallory blinked. "Only to clean it." There was a spill. He dropped a beaker the week before he died. Did he clean it himself? I believe so. Holmes knelt and gently lifted the edge of the rug. A pale stain bloomed across the floorboards beneath, not blood, but something chemical, its edges faintly scorched. Watson. I knelt beside him. Smells like ether, but laced with something metallic. Phosphorus, perhaps. Holmes murmured. He turned to Mrs. Mallory. Do you know what your husband was working on? She shook her head. He kept his research private. I asked once, and he said. She hesitated. He said it would only frighten me. Did you see his correspondence? Rarely. A few letters came from a Dr. E.K. Hawthorne, but they ceased last summer. Holmes raised an eyebrow. May I? She opened a drawer in the desk and handed over several thin envelopes, addressed in fine, almost calligraphic script. Holmes scanned the names with interest. Dr. Hawthorne of Edinburgh, he said. I know the name. Wrote an inflammatory paper on psychological contagion 2 years ago. Was laughed out of the Lancet. And yet, he tapped the envelope with a fingernail. Mallory kept his letters. Holmes straightened suddenly, walked to the bookshelf, and began scanning titles with increasing speed. Chemistry, pharmacology, anatomy. No. Where is it? He turned to Mrs. Mallory. Was there a black volume here? Slim, leather-bound? No title on the spine. She looked startled. Yes, he always kept it behind the blue ledger. Why, it is gone, Holmes said simply, and, in that moment, I saw her face change, not with surprise, with confirmation. I had hoped you wouldn't notice, she said quietly. Holmes tilted his head. Explain. I didn't remove it, she said, but I know who did. Go on. My late husband had a half-brother, Edward, estranged for years. They corresponded in secret, though I only discovered the letters recently. Edward is not well. He believes the world is ruled by coded symbols and hidden poisons. He thinks the Queen has been replaced by an actress. He once attempted to patent an invisible ink that only responds to the screams of the reader. I blinked. He's mad. She looked at me with tired eyes. Or brilliant. Or both. And you think he stole the book? I don't know how, she admitted. But I found muddy prints on the sill of the garden window 2 days ago. I wiped them away. Holmes gave a single, sharp nod. Then, tomorrow, Mrs. Mallory, we will call on Mr. Edward Mallory. As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet. The fog had thickened, curling under the carriage like smoke from an unseen pipe. Do you think she's telling the truth? I asked. Think she's telling a truth, Holmes replied, but not the only one. And what of the brother? Anyone who removes a book and leaves no trace but a print on a window frame, Holmes said, is either very clever or wants us to know he was here. The following morning broke with a pale, bone-white sun filtered through ribbons of frost and coal smoke. We breakfasted in silence. Holmes declined eggs. His appetite, I had long observed, waned in direct proportion to the complexity of a case. When he took only a half cup of tea and refused even his morning Times, I knew his thoughts were fully consumed. At precisely 8 o'clock, he stood, donned his coat, and announced, "We are going to Holloway, Watson." Holloway, I repeated. That's a rather bleak quarter for a gentleman's residence. Holmes smiled thinly. It is also a rather ideal quarter for one attempting to be unseen. We set out by cab, winding northeast through the awakening streets of London. Fruit sellers shouted through frozen breath. Milkmen rattled bottles against Rotherham gates. A newspaper boy sprinted across the cobbles, shouting something about a shipwreck in the channel, though Holmes, as ever, did not stir. Instead, he murmured, "You recall the prints on the garden window?" "Yes," I said. She said they were muddy from the brother. But there was no mud anywhere else in the room, Holmes replied. No smudge on the latch. No disturbed gravel on the sill. No scrape of leather across the interior floor. If he did enter, he did so without touching a single surface, or he never entered at all. Then the book was removed by someone else, I asked. Or never existed, Holmes said. Which is why we must see Mr. Edward Mallory ourselves, and learn what he believes he took. We found the man in a narrow boarding house on Grange Road, a thin building pressed between a shuttered bakery and a Jewish tailor's shop. Holmes produced the address with no explanation, though I gathered it had likely been obtained by telegram hours before dawn. The landlady, a woman with a hairnet and perpetual sniffle, seemed relieved to see us. "You hear about Mr. Mallory?" she asked. "Odd bird, that one, speaks to the wallpaper." She showed us to the top floor, where Edward Mallory kept a tour-room flat that smelled strongly of camphor and ink. The man himself opened the door before we knocked. He was in his early 50s, though his eyes were sunken and his beard unkempt. He wore a silk cravat over a threadbare waistcoat and kept glancing over his shoulder, not at the room, but at the ceiling, as though expecting it to cave in. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Holmes, extending a gloved hand, "and this is my associate, Dr. Watson." Edward Mallory didn't take the hand. Instead, he stared at Holmes for a long moment and then said, "I won't give it back." "We've not asked for anything," Holmes replied. "But you will," Mallory said, retreating inside. The sitting room was madness distilled into physical form. Newspaper clippings pinned with sewing needles formed a tapestry across the far wall. Strings of red and yellow yarn crisscrossed the space like a child's web. On one table lay a dismantled phonograph beside what looked to be melted candle wax and old revolver parts. On another, a stack of open notebooks, each page filled with symbols, not words, arranged in clock-like circles. In the far corner sat a locked glass case. Within it, a black leather-bound book, "You see," Mallory said triumphantly, noting our gaze. "It hums at night." Holmes stepped toward the case. "You believe this book contains what?" "A sequence," Mallory said. "That's all I'll say. The pages are numbered incorrectly on purpose. Some even fold inward. There's a cipher hidden in the footnotes." Holmes turned to him. "You entered your brother's home." "Of course I did," Mallory said, frowning. "He left the message. The blue ledger with the letter E scratched beneath the spine. That was the signal. He told me long ago that if I ever saw the ledger moved, just so, I was to retrieve the book and vanish." "Your brother was not in his right mind," I said gently. "No one in their right mind tries to warn the world," Edward snapped. Holmes raised his hand, and the bell. Mallory fell still. "What bell?" Holmes's voice became softer. "You took the book. You saw the rug. You saw what was burned into the floor beneath, but you missed what had been above it." Mallory's eyes widened. "He used it." Holmes nodded. Mallory slumped into a chair, his entire body seeming to deflate. Then we're already too late. It took nearly an hour to coax a coherent explanation from the man. It seemed that the Mallory brothers, once students of Cambridge, had become obsessed with the idea of acoustic influence, the notion that certain tonal sequences could induce changes in perception, memory, or even belief. The bell, as Edward called it, was not a simple chime. but a mechanism calibrated to emit subsonic vibrations, capable of unsettling the mind without conscious awareness. Sebastian said it was only a theory, Edward whispered. But he was lying. He built one, and he tested it on himself. Holmes stepped closer. And now he's dead. Edward nodded. Holmes said nothing. He turned to me. Watson, we must return to Draycott Lane immediately. By the time we reached the Mallory house again, the air had grown thicker with fog. A constable stood outside, looking pale and uncertain. There's been a break-in, he told us. Someone entered through the study window. Mrs. Mallory's gone. Holmes rushed inside, bypassing the officer entirely. The study was a mess. Books overturned, the rug burned further, and etched into the wall in faint reddish chalk, a circle bisected by a spiral. Holmes stared at it, as though reading a familiar signature. She activated the bell, he said quietly, to erase something, or someone. I shivered. Now, Holmes turned toward me now, he said. We must uncover what she tried to make us forget. In all the years I had observed Sherlock Holmes at work, I had grown used to his silences, to his peculiar habits of pacing, muttering, or collapsing suddenly into stillness as his mind devoured a problem whole. But that evening, back at Baker Street, I witnessed a version of Holmes I had only rarely seen, stiller than still, seated in his armchair with fingertips pressed tightly together, eyes half-lidded, as though in some trance between lucidity and madness. Holmes, I said gently, setting down a cup of tea he would never touch. Surely we ought to report Mrs. Mallory's disappearance to Scotland Yard. He did not look up. No, not yet. But why on earth not? Because we are not hunting a person, Watson. We are hunting a pattern, and patterns do not leave footprints. I confess that I was beginning to share some of the constable's bewilderment. There had been no signs of struggle in the study, no blood, no cries heard by the neighbors, nothing but the chalk sigil left on the wall, like a bad dream scrawled by candlelight. I've seen that shape before, Holmes murmured at last. In an old monograph by Dr. Hawthorne, he called it the spiral of induction. He believed it could be used as a visual trigger, a mnemonic device to forcibly suppress or unlock memory. Pseudoscientific nonsense, of course, except when it isn't. You think she erased her own memory? I asked. Or someone else's? The bell might have done the rest. I could not help but glance over my shoulder at the shadows flickering against the sitting room wall. This is beginning to feel less like deduction and more like, I hesitated, hallucination, Holmes offered dryly. That, my dear Watson, is precisely the problem. We are dealing with a crime designed not to be understood. He stood, finally, and paced to the mantel, where the dying fire cast uneven gold across his face. Let us review the facts, he said, in that sharp-edged tone that always preceded Revelation 1. Dr. Sebastian Mallory died suddenly in his study, with no obvious wound or poison found. His research, once dismissed, involved manipulating mental states through tone and symbol. 2. His widow reported a vague unease, not an accusation. She presented herself as both frightened and cooperative, yet failed to mention her estranged brother-in-law until directly prompted. 3. The so-called bell was real. We smelled its residue in the form of scorched phosphorus, likely triggered. An audio frequency intended to disrupt cognition or awareness. 4. Edward Mallory. while clearly disturbed, provided consistent detail about the ciphered journal and the use of acoustic devices. He claims Sebastian left a signal for him, a blue ledger displaced, and that he retrieved the black book accordingly. 5. Mrs. Mallory has now disappeared. No trace, no struggle. Only the spiral drawn on the wall, a symbol theorized to affect memory or perception. He turned toward me. And 6. The book is still missing. At this point, I could contain myself no longer. But Holmes, you don't seriously believe a tone, a sound, could kill a man, erase a memory, or cause a woman to vanish? He looked at me, not with scorn, but with a weary kind of pity. I believe, Watson, that people will do anything and believe anything if they are made to doubt the evidence of their own senses. He paused, then added quietly, the bell may not kill in the physical sense, but if it causes a man to question what is real, what is true, then it can render him useless, hollow, lost. I shivered. And the book likely contains the original research, diagrams, notes, perhaps the frequencies themselves. If Hawthorne contributed, it may also reference earlier theories of hypnotic induction. Holmes turned suddenly to his desk and began writing furiously. I peered over his shoulder. He was composing a telegram to Drek Hawthorne, Edinburgh, regarding your work. On symbolic induction and sound, does the spiral also erase as well as unlock? Have you corresponded with Sebastian Mallory since August? Reply urgently, -S.H. That evening passed uneasily. Holmes barely spoke. He declined supper. Around midnight, he retired to the couch, violin in hand, and drew the bow across the strings with haunting slowness. Not music, precisely, but a single, trembling note, again and again, as if listening for something to emerge from silence. I lay awake, the sound echoing through the flat, thinking of chalk spirals and silent studies, and a book locked in a glass case like a caged scream. At precisely 2 in the morning, there came a knock at the door. Holmes was already on his feet. Opened the door, and there, standing in the hallway, barefoot and drenched in fog, was Mrs. Mallory. She looked directly at me and said, with perfect calm, "Who is Sebastian?" She stood in our doorway like a statue, freshly unearthed, pale, damp, and bewildered. The lace of her sleeves clung wetly to her arms. Her boots were absent altogether, and her eyes held the vacant curiosity of someone half awake in a dream. "Who is Sebastian?" she asked again. Holmes, always more gentle in moments of madness than most would expect, stepped forward and offered her his handkerchief. "You are Mrs. Mallory," he said. She blinked. I believe so." Holmes turned to me sharply. "Watson, prepare tea, strong, and send for Inspector Gregson, quietly. She must not be left alone again." By the time Gregson arrived, the morning sun was forcing its way through a dense fog, turning the sitting room into a haze of diffused light and long shadows. Mrs. Mallory, or rather, the woman who no longer recognized her name, sat swaddled in one of Mrs. Hudson's thick wool blankets, sipping her tea with slow concentration. Holmes questioned her gently, but fruitlessly. She remembered nothing beyond waking up barefoot on Draycott Lane, her hands smeared with ash, and following the scent of a fire she couldn't place. No memory of her husband, nor of 2-1B, not even her own first name. "She's been unwritten," Holmes muttered, more to himself than to us. as if someone took a razor to the page of her mind. Gregson was unimpressed. You're saying she's forgotten her entire identity. That's convenient. Holmes fixed him with a look as cold as frost. No, Inspector. I'm saying she's been erased. There is nothing convenient about it. With no signs of trauma, no stolen property, and until now, no body, Gregson had hesitated to declare foul play. But with Mrs. Mallory reappearing in such a state, even he was forced to admit something was gravely amiss, Holmes insisted. We begin our inquiries immediately. There are 3 figures, he said, each tied to the Mallory case and each hiding more than they admit. The brother-in-law, the housemaid, and the publisher. Publisher, I asked. Indeed. Sebastian Mallory's final manuscript, the one supposedly refused. Publication may have been circulated privately. I suspect he had dealings we know nothing about. First, Edward Mallory. We returned to the man's cramped quarters in Islington and found him pacing feverishly. She's gone, he cried when we informed him of Mrs. Mallory's brief disappearance. You mustn't let her near the ledger. If she sees it, if she even hears the bell again, the ledger is missing. Holmes interrupted coolly. Edward froze. Then, someone else has it. Perhaps you, Holmes said. You knew the book existed. You knew about the bell. I told you everything I know. Holmes narrowed his eyes. That remains to be seen. We left him with an officer at his door. Next, the housemaid, Miss Constance Foyle. She had returned to the Mallory home, visibly shaken, but willing to speak. I never liked the doctor's experiments, she said. He'd have that awful tone playing from his gramophone at night, like a tea kettle crying from another room. And sometimes she'd be different in the morning, as if she'd lost a day and hadn't noticed. Did she ever mention voices, dreams? Holmes asked. Miss Foyle hesitated. She spoke to the walls, sir, called them listening. Once I found her scratching circles on the inside of a cupboard door, said it helped her sleep. Finally, the publisher. We visited the offices of Merton and Cray, where Sebastian had submitted his paper, only to be turned away. But the editor, Mr. Lionel Cray, met us with red-rimmed eyes and nervous hands. Yes, I rejected Mallory's manuscript, he admitted. Too dangerous, too speculative, but ... I did make a copy to show a friend at the university. Strictly off the record. Who was this friend? Holmes asked sharply. Cray swallowed. Dr. Erasmus Hawthorne of King's College. Holmes's eyes glittered. I telegraphed Hawthorne 2 days ago, he said. He has not replied. Returning to Baker Street, Holmes sank into his chair and closed his eyes. The pattern was beginning to coalesce, not clearly, but enough for him to trace its outline. Someone wants that manuscript, he said. Someone who understands what it can. Do Mrs. Mallory may have been the first successful subject? You mean ... the first person to be made to forget? Not merely forget, Watson, to become a living gap. A woman with no past and no present, only presence. She is a vessel now, vulnerable to whatever message comes next. I shuddered. And the suspects? Holmes tapped his fingertips. Edward. Mallory may have panicked. Miss Foyle may have witnessed more than she let on. Cray is afraid. But Hawthorne, he paused. Watson, we are being watched. I turned quickly and saw only the morning fog pressed against the glass. But Holmes was already rising. Pack your bag, he said. We are going to King's College. By the following morning, Holmes had transformed. Gone was the austere detective in his gray dressing gown. In his place stood a frail clerical scholar, bent by imagined age and lost in the folds of an ill-fitting tweed overcoat. He wore false spectacles, a graying wig, and a thin mustache that gave him the air of a forgetful librarian. The disguise was impeccable. I had to blink twice before recognizing him. "You will go ahead and present your card," he instructed. "I shall follow 5 minutes later under the name of Mr. Hatherla, a donor seeking to fund research in abnormal psychology." "And what is the purpose of this pantomime?" I asked, though I knew the answer. If Hawthorne knows more than he admits, he may only reveal it when he believes he's in the company of an ignorant ally. King's College shimmered with mid-morning drizzle as we arrived. The great iron gates yawned open before us, flanked by watchful porters. Inside, the courtyard was a picture of learned calm. Students hunched beneath umbrellas, tutors pacing with scrolls, the muffled echoes of lectures drifting from tall Gothic windows. Dr. Erasmus Hawthorne's office, as it turned out, was housed in the north wing of the psychology building, an imposing brick structure that had once served as a monastery. The brass placard on his door read, "Dr. Hawthorne, Faculty of Neural Philosophy and Experimental Memory." I knocked and stepped inside. Hawthorne was a curious man, thin, bird-like, with eyes that never stopped moving. He wore a velvet jacket and fingerless gloves, and his breath smelled faintly of cloves. Books were piled in hazardous towers about the room, many open to diagrams of brains, labyrinths, and bells. "Dr. John Watson," I introduced myself, former Army surgeon, current medical writer, and sometime assistant to Sherlock Holmes. A flicker crossed his face at Holmes's name. Not fear, not quite, but something adjacent. "Ah, yes, the gentleman detective," Hawthorne said. "To what do I owe the visit?" "I come regarding Dr. Sebastian Mallory." At the mention of Mallory, Hawthorne's fingers stiffened around his teacup. "Dead, is he?" he asked, too casually. I nodded. "You were aware?" "I had heard. From Mr. Cray at Merton, I assume." "Yes, Sebastian and I were loosely acquainted. He was a visionary, though rather too taken with symbols and ritual." "You read his manuscript?" "Oh yes," he said, smiling faintly. "A strange little tract, bells that alter cognition, patterns of tone that supposedly delete memories. Fascinating, but quite mad. Did you keep a copy?" Hawthorne's face was unreadable. "No, I returned it to Cray." A lie. 5 minutes later, as arranged, Mr. Hatherla arrived. Holmes entered the room with a cane and a tremble, mumbling apologies about funding, lectures, and the noble madness of human recollection. He dropped clumsily into a chair and praised Hawthorne's work with the breathless enthusiasm of a harmless old benefactor. Hawthorne, amused and off guard, began to talk freely. Yes, we're doing remarkable work here. Very exciting, the possibility of voluntary forgetting. Not mere repression, mind you, but active neural deletion. We even had a case study once. A woman, poor thing, who lost her entire self." "Mrs. Mallory?" Holmes asked. The room froze. There it was, the slip. Hawthorne's eyes widened. I never mentioned her name." Holmes stood and peeled off his glasses with theatrical slowness. "No," he said quietly, "you didn't." The professor stepped back instinctively. "You lied to me," Holmes continued, removing his wig. "You claimed to have returned the manuscript, yet you kept it. You experimented with it, and you used Mrs. Mallory as your subject. She volunteered, Hawthorne said quickly. Sebastian was obsessed. He wanted to prove the bell's effects. I warned him, but he insisted she forgot everything, Holmes said coldly. And you let her walk barefoot into the night. Hawthorne collapsed into his chair. It worked, he whispered. The bell, the ink, the pattern. She heard the tone once, and in 20 seconds she could no longer recall her name. You erased a woman's mind like chalk from a slate, I said, appalled. And if I hadn't, Hawthorne snapped, Sebastian would have done it anyway. At least I documented it. Where is that documentation now? Holmes asked. Hawthorne nodded to a drawer behind him. Locked, but not destroyed. Then I suggest you prepare to surrender it to Scotland Yard, Holmes said. Immediately, we left the university with a stack of notes, sketches, and diagrams, and, most chillingly, a recording cylinder labeled Test Tone Number 3, Inactive Dissonance, Mallory, back in our carriage. Holmes held it delicately. This may be the last trace of Mallory's madness, he said, or the first evidence of something deeper. We still do not know who else has heard the bell. What about Mrs. Mallory? I asked. If she heard it once, might she be susceptible again? She already is, Holmes said. Her mind is a wound, and someone is still holding the knife. Holmes spent the next 48 hours in a state of possessed calculation. He did not sleep. He barely ate. His violin lay untouched on the window ledge while Holmes hovered between his desk and the floor, surrounded by scattered documents, ink-stained bell curves, and notes he refused to explain. From the armchair, I watched as he tore through diagrams, Hawthorne's confession, and the cylinder marked Test Tone Number 3, though he dared not play it. I have seen things, Watson, he murmured once, without turning. Clues within signals, lies stitched into sound. These are not merely bells, they are memories in disguise. I asked him what that meant. He gave no answer. On the evening of the second day, Holmes finally beckoned me over. Upon his desk was a sketch, not of a person, but a symbol, a circle, divided into 8 segments. At each division was a different shape, a crescent, a flame, a feather, a triangle, and others more arcane. It resembled a clock, or a sigil, or both. This, Holmes said, was at the bottom corner of every page in Mallory's manuscript, faint, almost invisible. I thought it a watermark, but it is a key. A key to what? To the order of tones, Holmes said, and the order of forgetting. He placed the cylinder in my hand. Test Tone Number 3 was not the first, he said, nor the last. Mallory produced 8 such tones, each aligned to a concept: name, location, fear, time, guilt. I stared at the object as if it might whisper. Holmes continued. When played in the proper sequence, they do not merely erase memory, they rewrite perception. What was a house becomes a shadow. A person becomes a dream. Events unthread from time. Do you believe that? I asked. I believe Mallory did, Holmes said grimly. And worse, I believe someone else still does. From the symbol, the divided circle, Holmes traced names. Not the names we had encountered, but initials. S.M., Sebastian, Mallory, V. Annalise, Vernon, H. Erasmus, Hawthorne, J.C. Julian Cray, 4 names, I said. For bells, Holmes shook his head. For experimenters, each possessing at least 1 tone. and each, until now, assuming they were alone. I leaned forward. Then Mallory wasn't a madman working in isolation. No, Holmes said. He was part of a circle, a clandestine group, academic, yes, but not moral. I felt a coldness take root in my chest. Holmes pulled another item from his desk drawer, a letter, undated, unsigned, in the same typeface as the ominous note we had once received that read, "There are 3 bells left." This one was shorter, just a single line. The tone for time remains missing. Beneath it, a hand-drawn image, a spiral descending into blackness. Holmes looked at me with rare unease. "Watson, whoever sent this believes that time itself, or at least memory of time, can be manipulated," I asked, quietly. "And what would happen to someone who lost all sense of time?" Holmes exhaled. "They would cease to distinguish yesterday from never." That evening we returned to Merton Hall, the institution where Cray had once resided. Holmes suspected Cray had left something behind. A trace, a residue of obsession, too dangerous to keep and too terrible to destroy. The hall was locked. Holmes picked it. He did not explain. I followed in silence. Inside, the old study had not been touched. A layer of dust covered the oak desk. Books lay strewn across the floor, not vandalized, but abandoned, as though Cray had simply walked out one day and never returned. Holmes headed straight for the fireplace. "Dust is thicker here," he muttered, recently disturbed. From the chimney flue, Holmes extracted a small metal box. It bore no keyhole, only a sliding mechanism along the top, shaped like the same 8-segmented circle we had seen before. He rotated it 3 clicks left, 1 right, then paused. "Mallory. Always aligned guilt with flame," he murmured, "and fear with the triangle." With a final click, the box opened. Inside were 5 more wax cylinders, each marked with a Roman numeral and a symbol. Holmes took them out slowly, like relics from a forgotten cult. "It is all here," he whispered, "the rest of the tones." We returned home in silence. At Baker Street, Holmes arranged the cylinders in a line along the table, 8 in all, including the one from Hawthorne. 8 tones, 8 methods of erasure. He sat back, folded his arms, and said something I did not expect. "I am no longer solving a crime, Watson. I am chasing an ideology." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "These bells are not mere instruments. They are beliefs made audible, each one tailored to remove what Mallory and his circle deemed unnecessary: memory, guilt, time, even fear." He looked to me, eyes unreadable. "And someone still wants to ring them." It was the sound of the bell that woke me, not the pleasant chime of the front door or the clatter of the postman's call, but a high, metallic ring that vibrated through the walls of 2-1B like the echo of a struck blade. It came from Holmes's study, and by the time I burst in, dressing gown half buttoned, he was standing stock still, one hand on the phonograph, the other hovering above a wax cylinder labeled IV time. The bell had stopped, but its memory had not. Holmes turned to me slowly. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused. "I only played 3 seconds, he whispered, and then he collapsed. It took nearly 10 minutes before Holmes came back to himself. I had roused Mrs. Hudson for brandy, and when she arrived, Holmes waved her off with a weak gesture and mumbled something about the properties of auditory saturation. His hands trembled. He seemed not to recognize the study. or me at first. I was nowhere, he finally said, his voice hollow. Not darkness, not silence, just absence. No before, no after. Only the sense that time had been removed like a bandage. No wound beneath, no skin even. I helped him to the couch and sat beside him. You mustn't do that again, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. You might not come back. He nodded slowly. I may not have. Holmes slept for nearly a full day after that. When he awoke, he was himself again, though quieter, his movements less brisk, his gaze more haunted. He asked for tea, then for a map of southwest London. There's a pattern to the bell's movement, he said, half to himself. Mallory's came from Dorset, Hawthorne's from Hammersmith, Cray's from Lambeth. The cylinders are orbiting, drawn toward a center. He tapped his finger on a circle he had drawn around a small district. I had seldom thought of Draycott Lane, near the old waterworks, now mostly ruins and industry. Why there? I asked. Holmes simply said, that's where she died. He meant Enolis Vernon. Holmes had not spoken her name since our first visit, but now something in him had changed. A grim sense of duty, perhaps, or a deeper knowledge of what her death truly meant. She was the first, Holmes said. Not just the first to die, but the first to forget. Her bell was the prototype, the tone for guilt. He held up a battered journal, her name etched on the inside cover. She didn't keep a diary, he explained, not in the usual sense. These are instructions, test procedures. Her writing becomes more erratic over time. Verbs vanish, dates blur, until finally she forgets her own address. He placed the book down, then stared at me. She wrote a final entry. If I ring it again, I will be clean. We went to Draycott Lane the following morning. It was raining, not heavily, but persistently, like the sky was weeping without. Sobs. The lane itself was half abandoned, gas lamps flickering, a few workers moving crates across muddy alleys, and the smell of coal smoke clinging to every brick. At the end of the lane stood a chapel, or what remained of it, a charred husk, its steeple broken, its bell long gone. This, Holmes said, was where the first full sequence was tested. The fire was reported as accidental. No bodies were found. But Vernon's name vanished from all ledgers after that week. We entered cautiously. Inside the chapel, time had stopped, or at least surrendered. Pews sat like skeletons. The altar had collapsed. But behind it, a small trapdoor had been recently disturbed. Holmes opened it without hesitation, and we descended into darkness. The room below was lined with copper coils and damp wood. Wires connected to brass panels. A reel of magnetic tape lay twisted on the floor, and in the center, a stone pedestal, upon which sat the final wax cylinder. No label, just a ribbon tied around it, and a tag that read 8 South Holmes. Stood for a long moment, then said only, "We're not meant to hear this one." That night, we returned to Baker Street with the final tone in our possession, and a renewed sense of dread. Holmes placed the last cylinder into a wooden box, which he locked with a key from his violin case. "This one does not get played," he said, "not unless the world itself begins to lie." I asked him what he meant. He did not answer, but instead took a sheaf of papers from his drawer, listing the effects of each tone, matched against recovered data from Mallory and the others. Name removes personal identity place, removes sense of location fear, suppresses emotional responses time, distorts temporal awareness guilt, erodes ethical boundaries memory, erases recent experiences, pain blocks physical sensations, self unknown. We sat in silence for a long time. Then Holmes said something I shall never forget. They weren't creating amnesia, Watson. They were creating perfect criminals. In all my years beside Sherlock Holmes, from the hounds of Dartmoor to the bullet-riddled walls of Reichenbach, I had rarely seen him frightened. But now, fear had crept into him in a curious way, not as trembling or retreat, but as a relentless, burning compulsion. It showed in the tightness of his jaw, in the way his fingers drummed with feverish rhythm along the mantelpiece. The man who once delighted in the art of detection now acted like a prisoner sketching keys into the plaster with a spoon. He barely ate, slept in uneven intervals, and though the streets of London carried on hansoms clattering lamplighters, whistling Holmes scarcely noticed. He moved through time as if it were water thick with secrets. By the third day after our visit to Draycott Lane, Holmes had covered every surface of the sitting room in overlapping sheets of paper, diagrams of bells, of wave patterns, of human brains, the latter clipped from medical journals, annotated in his slanted, impatient hand. Phrases appeared on every corner of every page: induced psychogenic lacuna, frequency-induced negation of identity, not hypnosis, not suggestion. Worse, he no longer spoke to me in full thoughts, but fragments. The bell isn't a signal, it's a subtraction, he muttered once, eyes bloodshot, a reversal of imprinting, like scraping a name off wet cement. Another time, Vernon knew it wouldn't stop with her. That's why she tied the eighth tone in a ribbon, like a warning on a trigger. And then, what if this wasn't a weapon? What if it was a solution? He had begun experimenting again, though he never admitted it aloud. I found the phonograph left running one evening, turning slowly with no cylinder inside. The air smelled faintly of burnt wax. His violin stood untouched in the corner, the bow string half snapped, as if in frustration. "Holmes," I said finally, "you're killing yourself over this." He looked up sharply from a pile of scattered dossiers. His expression softened, only for a moment. "You think I care for my health, Watson?" "I think you care for the truth," I said. "But I know what happens when you let it consume you." He didn't reply, but he did not look away either. That night, he asked me to sit across from him, a gesture that felt almost ceremonial. He opened his notes and began reading them aloud, not to inform, but to confess. "Do you recall the Vernon girl's last entry?" he asked. I nodded. "If I ring it again, I will be clean." Holmes leaned forward. What if that wasn't madness? What if she meant it literally, that the tone erased whatever burden she carried? "A moral lobotomy," I said. Chilled, he nodded. "You see, Watson, that's why the military wanted it. Not just to wipe minds, but to make men do anything without guilt, pain, or memory." I recoiled. "You're suggesting they could manufacture soldiers who feel no conscience?" He raised his hand, correcting me. "Not soldiers, my dear Watson, citizens." In the days that followed, Holmes left the flat more frequently, but only at night, and never by cab. He wandered down to the Thames. "We're being misused." One evening he returned, soaked through, a bandage around his wrist and soot in his hair. Fool of a man had built one in a furnace pipe. He did not speak. Again, for 2 hours, It was at that point I began sending quiet telegrams to old friends. Lestrade responded with polite bafflement. My old military surgeon recommended a rest cure in Scotland. Not until he had finished assembling what he called the map of negation. When I looked at it, dozens of points across the country, linked with red thread and inked formulas, I felt something cold grip me. There was a pattern, a deliberate spiral, like someone was preparing to ring something far larger than a bell. Holmes stared at it like a man reading the future. We're not tracking crimes anymore, he said softly. We're tracking the loss of selves. On the 7th night, I awoke to find Holmes standing over the phonograph again, the 8th cylinder in his hand. He was pale, drenched in sweat, and utterly still. Don't, I whispered. He turned to me slowly, his eyes strange and clear. I wasn't going to, he said, but I wanted to see if I still wanted to. It was on a storm-slick morning in late October that Holmes turned to me with the air of a man who had made peace with a decision long resisted. Watson. At him, teacup half-raised. You mean to reactivate the device? I intend to simulate its tones and observe who reacts. Those who built it have trained their minds to respond to it, like birds bred to sing at a signal. If we sound that signal, even imperfectly, they will come. The plan, as always with Holmes, was simple in form and maddening in detail. He would place a disguised phonograph within the old stables, behind 18 Draycott Lane, now condemned and watched only by a half-blind constable on rotation, using tones reconstructed from Miss Vernon's notes and his own research, in the shadows of the vicar's path, armed with a whistle and a revolver. He did not believe we would need them. This is not a confrontation, he said. It is an invitation. The preparations took 3 days. What looked like a standard wax cylinder, but had been treated with resin. Then briefly, I felt an odd pulling sensation just behind my ears. Not pain, something like pressure in the soul. They target memory, not hearing, Holmes murmured, as if diagnosing a fever. Listen to long, and you'll forget what you're forgetting. On the evening of the operation, fog blanketed Chelsea in ghostly coils. Holmes wore a brown cloak and cap I had never seen before, timer quietly ticking. Holmes's movements were deliberate, mechanical, as though he had practiced them in secret, long before I was told. At 2 a.m., we took our positions. Holmes settled on a bench near the old linden tree, barely visible from the path. I crouched behind a hedge of bramble and rusted fence posts. A church bell rang in the distance, not the one, of course, but close enough to make my skin crawl. At 3:15 a.m., I glanced toward Holmes. He remained utterly still, a silhouette against the gray mist. At 3:17 a.m., the phonograph clicked to life. The tones that followed did not sound like music. They sounded like forgottenness itself. I do not remember hearing them. What I remember is the feeling as though my name had slipped from my own mouth and vanished into the ground. For a moment, I forgot why I was crouching. I forgot who I was watching for. And then, movement. 2 shadows emerged from the alley beside the grocer's shop. Another from the roofline of the apothecary, and one thin, precise, from behind the vicarage wall. No one spoke. They did not run. One of them, a tall man in a naval coat, removed his hat and touched his hand to the boarded door. Another knelt beside the phonograph's hidden slot as if greeting a relic, then, as suddenly as they had come. In the fog she turned, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw her face. It was Miss Vernon. My breath caught. I raised the whistle, but before I could blow it, she lifted one finger to her lips. Then, slowly, she tapped it 3 times against her own temple, checking the mechanism. "They touched nothing," he said softly. "They only came to hear, like monks at prayer." We returned to Baker Street in silence. He did not speak again until dawn, when the light through the windows glinted off his violin case. "I think we've drawn them out," he said finally. "Now we must ask what they'll do next, and what we are willing to forget to stop them." No newspaper bore any cryptic report of a disturbance in Chelsea, and Miss Vernon, or the thing that resembled her, did not show herself again. Holmes, for all his earlier intensity, lapsed into a grim silence. He spent long hours staring at the phonograph cylinder, now resting inert on our mantelpiece, as though it might turn on its own. "Have we failed?" I asked at last. "The bait was taken, yet we've no leads, no confession, not even a crime to pin them to. Brickwork." But, as the noise persisted, I rose and followed it into the sitting room. There, under the dim amber of the gas lamp, sat Holmes in his dressing gown, violin discarded beside him, pencil in hand. He had filled 3 pages with what appeared to be random symbols, spirals, notations. It's desperation. Holmes didn't look up. "There is a pattern, Watson. I am simply attempting to hear it." It unnerved me. I had seen Holmes obsessed before. I had witnessed his monomaniacal focus in cases of baffling murder and political intrigue. But this was different. This was a man trying to interpret silence. That morning, I suggested he sleep. He refused. "Sleep may no longer be safe," he said. I believe they are now listening to us." At midday, Inspector Lestrade arrived uninvited. He looked unusually perturbed, and Holmes, despite his wan complexion, invited him in with an outstretched hand. "Do you know a man named Captain Dunwell?" Lestrade asked, as he sat down. His bowler, retired naval engineer, lived alone above a grocer's off Draycott Lane. Holmes's brow lifted. No sign of trauma, poison, or struggle. Just dead. Something he didn't understand. Lestrade left shortly after, grumbling about secrets and OCCULTISTS. Holmes said nothing for a full hour. Then he stood up, walked to the phonograph, and without warning snapped the cylinder in 2. Waxed shards scattered across the hearthrug. "That was our only recording," I shouted. "Exactly," he said, eyes blazing. "And it was made too well. They didn't need to come because they'd already heard it." I stared at him. "What are you suggesting?" "That we were not the only ones listening," he replied coldly. "That Vernon, or the thing she became, planted that recording among us. That Captain Dunwell heard it from the inside of his mind. It was then I saw it, for the first time in our long friendship. Sherlock Holmes did not know. He was floundering in the dark, surrounded by clues that defied the very structure of reason. His face had the look not of defeat, but of irrelevance. "I misjudged them," he whispered. "Then, very softly, I played their game, and they changed the rules." That night, I stayed awake in my chair beside the fire, my revolver on the table. Holmes paced only once, briefly, then vanished into his room. I heard no violin, no cough, no scratching, only the ghost of a bell that never rang, and never stopped. I must confess, I had begun to fear for Holmes's reason. The man who had once teased criminals into confession with a raised brow now seemed afraid to speak above a whisper. He spent the day after Captain Dunwell's death in almost complete silence, declining tea, tobacco, and even the daily paper. It was I who fetched the post that afternoon, and in that modest pile of correspondence, tucked between a hospital invoice and an advertisement for Turkish slippers, I found a letter addressed to Holmes. The handwriting was unmistakable, Miss Vernon. It was dated a day prior, before Dunwell's death, and bore no return address. I opened it with trembling fingers and read aloud, "Mr. Holmes, you warned me not to listen. I tried, but it plays even when I sleep. I understand now that it is not a voice, it is a command. He told me to bury it, that if I buried it, they would stop. Guy did as he asked. You may find what you need at St. Britta's, beneath the third stone from the west, Transept. Please do not try to find me. I will be in silence." E.V. Holmes, who had been staring vacantly into the fire, rose at once. "St. Britta's," he said, "the parish where she first claimed to hear the bell. Come, Watson, we may yet unravel this knot." We hired a cab at once and set off through the dimming haze of a London dusk. St. Britta's stood like a broken tooth amidst the alleyways of Bermondsey, a forgotten stone relic, shuttered since the cholera outbreaks. Its gates creaked as we entered, and the church itself was locked. Holmes scaled the iron fence and unlocked it. From within, with a rusted pick, he withdrew from his cufflink. Inside, the chapel lay in a veil of dust and damp, shattered pews, broken windows, and forgotten votive stands blackened with soot. Yet in the west transept, exactly where she described, there was a stone out of place, not freshly moved, but subtly tilted, like a crooked tooth in the mouth of God. Holmes knelt beside it and whispered, "Help me." We pried it loose, and beneath it, swaddled in yellowing muslin, lay a velvet pouch, the kind used to store medals or valuables. Inside was a key, not a house key, but old and ornate bronze, with a lion's face at the bow and a series of numbers etched along the shaft. 947 LCV. Holmes stared at it in silence. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Good Lord," I said. "You know what it opens." "I do," he replied, pocketing it. "And it changes everything." Back at Baker Street, Holmes disappeared into his study for 2 hours. When he emerged, his hair was wild, his eyes bloodshot, and he carried with him a stack of blueprints. "London Carriage and Vault Company," he said, spreading them across our table. "Specifically, their Legacy Vault Division, LCV." He tapped the edge of the blueprint. "Vault number 947, a defunct private holding beneath the old Goldbourne Road branch, closed in 1879. According to their own ledgers, it should be empty. And yet she had the key," I murmured. Holmes nodded grimly. "Which means someone forgot to remove its contents, or someone very much wanted them to remain hidden." The following morning, we visited the Goldbourne Road depot under the pretense of collecting a mislaid family will. Holmes, ever the actor, produced a forged letter of authorization with the flourish of a magician. The vault was opened for us by a trembling young clerk who seemed unaware of the relic he was revealing. We descended a spiral staircase of iron and mildew, arriving at a corridor lined with small arched doors. Vault 947 was the third from the end. Holmes inserted the lion-headed key. It turned with surprising ease. Inside was a single item, a wooden box. Holmes carried it carefully to the table and opened it. Inside lay a manuscript, no more than 30 pages, hand-bound with waxed thread. Its title, in faded ink, "The Bell and the Chamber, Observations on Cognitive Collapse Through Resonant Command." It was signed Dr. Phineas Carswell, Royal Society of Experimental Psychology, 1854. Beneath the name was a note, suppressed by order. We read in silence. The text detailed a series of experiments conducted on asylum patients using controlled auditory stimuli, bells of various frequencies, played at mathematically calculated intervals. Subjects exposed to the resonant pattern developed identical symptoms, memory erosion, identity confusion, and eventually full cognitive inversion, believing they were other people, sometimes even objects. But one subject, noted only as Subject H, had the opposite response. He heard a voice. It told him things, showed him shapes. He died 5 days later, smiling. Holmes closed the manuscript and said quietly, "This is not a crime of passion. It is an experiment that never ended." And then he did something I shall never forget. He took a match to the edges of the paper. I lunged to stop him, but he stayed my hand. "No one else must hear it," he said, "not even us." And as the flame consumed the last page, I swear I heard it again. A bell, faint, distant, and somehow inside me. The events of the following evening remain etched into my memory, not for their outward drama, but for the quiet, skin-prickling dread. Knock at Baker Street, timid at first, then oddly rhythmic, as though meant to rattle only the nerves of those who knew the pattern. Holmes did not look up from his violin. "Watson," he said, "open the door, but do not speak. Let the silence introduce us." I obeyed. Outside stood a woman, no older than 30, cloaked in black, with gloves too fine for her worn face. Her cheeks were sunken, her eyes red-rimmed, and in one trembling hand she held a folded page. She stepped inside, took 3 careful strides into the sitting room, and laid the paper on the table between us. Holmes nodded, but did not greet her. Only, after a long pause, did he speak. "You're not Elizabeth Vernon?" "No," she replied, but I heard her scream. The woman introduced herself as Clara Vente, a chambermaid at the Hillgate Asylum on the western fringe of the city. She had worked there for 4 years, long enough to stop asking questions, but 2 nights prior she had been summoned to the East Wing, A Wing, officially closed since 1889, to bring linens to a patient whose name was not on any chart. The man, she said, wore a wax-sealed collar and sat muttering to himself in the dark. There was no light, no staff, no records. But in his hand he clutched a drawing. She passed it to Holmes, a spidery ink sketch, crude and childlike, of a bell. Not a church bell, but something deeper, stranger. A bell made of layers, with what looked like an ear drawn inside. It, and below it, in shaky hand, "Tell the man in smoke the bell was never real. Tell the man in smoke the bell was never real. Tell the man in smoke." It trailed off in blotted ink. Holmes froze. His jaw tensed. "You've shown this to no one?" he asked. She shook her head. "I was afraid, but I saw her, Miss Vernon. She was in the old ward last night. She wasn't alone, and she wasn't speaking English. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Holmes stood and took his coat. "We go now," he said. "This asylum may be the final chamber of the bell." The Hillgate Asylum stood like a rotting tooth at the edge of a railway depot, a forgotten relic of Victorian idealism, now mottled with mildew and silence. We arrived just before midnight. Fog clung to the wrought iron fence, and the moon shone dimly through a cracked glass dome above the entrance hall, taught Clara. Venn unlocked the servants' gate and led us down a passage not shown on the visitors' diagrams, a corridor of warped floorboards and rusting gas pipes. "This way," she whispered, "to the east wing." As we stepped into the corridor, I felt the temperature drop. There was something wrong with the air, too still, too heavy, like breath being held. The east wing was indeed sealed, boards nailed over the windows, paint curling from the walls. But one door had been recently disturbed. A chain, now rusted through, lay broken at its base. Tom's examined it briefly, then pushed the door inward. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single oil lamp. On the far side, facing the wall, stood a man, naked but for a patient's smock, thin, almost skeletal. His skin was marked with what looked like self-inflicted scratches, and in his ears were rolled plugs of wax, stuffed in so deeply they protruded like thorns. He turned and smiled. I recognized the face, Captain Dunwell, or rather, someone who looked exactly like him, alive, breathing. Holmes stepped forward cautiously. "You were supposed to be dead," he said softly. The man, Dunwell, or his double, replied in a clear voice, "I was only the echo." He took one step forward. The lamp flickered then. Behind us, a sound, not from the room, not from the hallway, but inside the walls. A low, metallic resonance, like the tolling of a bell, dampened by flesh. Holmes turned sharply. "We leave, now." But the door slammed. "Shut behind us," Clara screamed. I lunged forward to wrench it open, but it was bolted from the outside. Holmes remained calm, scanning the walls with his eyes, not his hands. "Listen," he whispered. And we did. The sound was everywhere now, not loud but constant. A humming in the bones, a pressure in the throat, a rhythm steady, hypnotic, wrong. Holmes tore the wax from the figure's ears. He collapsed instantly, unconscious. "The bell is real, only when heard," Holmes said, "and the hearing is willed." He threw his coat over my head. "Watson, sing anything louder than this madness." I began reciting the only thing I could remember, a military hymn from my days in Afghanistan. Loud, discordant, off-key. It helped. The sound wavered, faltered, and then the door opened, not by hand, but as if someone or something had stepped. Back we ran, outside, breathless and reeling. Holmes turned to Clara. "Burn it," he said. "The drawing, the ward records, everything." She nodded, too afraid to ask questions. Back at Baker Street, Holmes poured himself a brandy and collapsed into his armchair. "We were not in a chamber," he murmured. "We were in the bell itself." And then, almost inaudibly, he added, "They were ringing it from the inside." Our return to Baker Street in the gray hours before dawn was marked by an uncharacteristic silence. Holmes, pale and twitching at the corners of his mouth, stood at the hearth with one hand pressed to his temple and the other absently dragging his violin bow across the strings in a discordant tremor. The instrument gave a thin, whining sound, not unlike the echo we had fled at Hillgate. "Watson," he said at last, "I have underestimated the depth of this affair. It is no longer merely a matter of falsified identities and concealed relationships. We are dealing with a design so vast in its implications that I dare not fully speak of it until it has been severed at its root." He turned to me, eyes bloodshot, voice low. "But that root," he said, "sits in a study in Belgravia and signs its name as Sir Cedric Langford." Sir Cedric Langford, barrister and philanthropist, was a pillar of London society. He funded charitable asylums, sat on hospital boards, and was known for giving winter coats to orphans at Christmas. He was also, as Holmes now suspected, the architect behind the inner bell. By the time the sun broke through the morning fog, Holmes had already dispatched 3 telegrams and a note to Inspector Gregson at Scotland Yard. He refused breakfast, refused rest, only black tea, taken in silence, and a single sentence: "Today we ring the bell backwards." Langford's estate was not far, a pristine terrace facing Green Park. We arrived under official pretext, accompanied by 2 yardmen who, while skeptical, had learned the hard way not to ignore Holmes's instincts. Sir Cedric greeted us in a velvet robe, the picture of civil gentility. "My dear Holmes," he said, smiling thinly, "to what do I owe the honor?" Holmes did not smile back. "You will permit us to search your study." There was a pause, and then he stepped aside. Of course, the study was rich with detail: shelves of leather-bound law volumes, a decanter of port, a globe that still bore the faded boundary lines of the East India Company. Holmes went straight to the writing desk. "Ah," he said softly, pulling a loose panel free. Inside were a bundle of telegrams, correspondence with various provincial sanitariums, and one telegram, unsigned, stamped with a red insignia. He read it aloud. "Subject responds to 3rd auditory simulation. Instruct relocation to Hillgate via false death certification. Delay London registrar. Maintain bell isolation." Holmes turned slowly. "Mr. Langford," he said, "you have been manufacturing madness." Langford laughed. It was not the laugh of a man caught in deceit, but of one who believes himself beyond consequence. "Oh, Holmes," he said, "you cannot arrest an idea." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You're correct. But I can arrest you for concealment of a living person, fraudulent death certificates, and conspiracy to pervert public health laws." Langford raised his hand, and before anyone could move, he crushed a small glass vial between his fingers. A bitter, pungent smell filled the air. Holmes shouted for the constables, but Langford had already slumped into his chair, face twitching, eyes rolling back. He had taken something, a neurotoxin. Holmes guessed, not to die, but to buy time. We had no choice but to call for a physician and place Langford under house arrest. He knew we were coming, which means someone told him, which means he stopped suddenly, then said, "Pack your revolver. We return to Draycott Lane tonight." The fog was heavier than before, thick as oilcloth, and we moved through it like ghosts. Holmes moved with surgical precision, lantern held high. We reached the corner where Elizabeth Vernon had first approached us. The crooked lane doesn't care about truth, only timing. "Come alone. Evie," he handed me the note. "She's drawing me out." But for what end? Before I could answer, a sound sliced through the stillness. Not a bell, but a click. From behind us, we turned and saw the glint of metal, a barrel, held by a man whose face we had seen once before. Drawn and gaunt in the east wing of Hillgate, Captain Dunwell, or whoever had worn his face. He stepped forward. "Dr. Watson," he said to me. "Holmes, a permission." Holmes held up a hand. "You're not him. You're not done." "Well, no," the man said. "I'm just the voice they gave him." At that moment, a whistle blew, sharp and sudden, from the alleyway behind him, and I tackled him to the ground. The revolver clattered into the gutter. "Enough lies," said he's trained, or conditioned, or perhaps rewritten. That was the goal of Hillgate, Watson. Signal was, and Langford. There are times, rare but unforgettable, when Sherlock Holmes, for all his pride and precision, finds himself tangled in a knot even he must sit quietly to untie. The day after our return from Draycott Lane, I found him in that state, seated before the fireplace, fingertips pressed together, his brow furrowed, not with frustration, but with the grim satisfaction of final comprehension. "It is all there, Watson," he said at last. "Every piece, every echo, every bell that was not a bell." He gestured for me to sit. "Begin with the widow. Elizabeth Vernon was not a widow, at least not in the conventional sense. Her husband, Captain Marcus Dunwell, had not died in the Burmese campaign as reported. Instead, he had been transferred, or rather, because Dunwell had begun to hear what he should not. Not voices, not hallucinations, but a tone, a frequency, a bell. He described it, Holmes said, as something he could not hear but could not ignore. It rang not in the ears, but in the spine. It induced confusion, fear, obedience, and then silence. Complete emotional silence. A state some of Langford's associates called moral nullity. "Then why fake his death?" I asked. "To remove him from public record," Holmes replied. His testimony posed a risk to a larger experiment. Langford, under the guise of mental health reform, had been funding a covert neurological study. His aim was to develop a method of suppressing moral reflex, not simply dulling conscience, but eliminating it through auditory suggestion. The bell was not literal. It was a coded pattern of pulses, rhythmic sound bursts, designed to induce cognitive misdirection. He called it a hymn of forgetting, Holmes said, and Hillgate was his cathedral. "And the drawing?" I asked. "The bell with the ear." Holmes nodded. "A warning, or perhaps a confession, created by Dunwell in the fog of his induced delirium. He knew he was being erased, not in body, but in essence. The telegrams Holmes had discovered in Langford's desk revealed a hidden network of patients who had exhibited similar symptoms, vivid dreams of tolling sounds. All of them had passed through Hillgate or one of its feeder institutions. They were being tested for their ability to resist the bell, Holmes said. And those who could not, vanished. "But how does Elizabeth Vernon fit in?" Holmes leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "She was not a victim. She was an assistant, a nurse who developed an attachment to Dunwell during his detainment. Whether by guilt or love, she chose to smuggle a copy of his final drawing to us. The bell was never meant to be understood, only to be delivered." He retrieved her final note, the one left on the door at Draycott Lane. "I told the truth, but the bell doesn't care about truth, only timing." She was trying to warn us, Holmes said, that the bell doesn't summon knowledge. It suppresses it, and it was being refined to perfection. "The echo," I murmured. The phrase he used in the asylum. Holmes nodded gravely. Yes, Dunwell said. I am only the echo. It was not poetic. It was literal. He had been reduced, not in memory, but in autonomy. That was Langford's experiment. Not to control the body, but the moral will. Could suppress conscience, bend will, induce obedience without awareness. It chilled the blood more than any pistol or blade. And you believe they succeeded? I asked. Holmes took a long breath. They succeeded enough to hide it in plain sight. Langford's trial will be public, but the truth of what he developed, that will be buried quietly in state files and medical jargon. They will say he went too far with sound therapy. They will not say what we know. I watched him closely. Holmes, for all his logical detachment, looked older, not weary, but dimmed. The real bell, he said, was not a device. It was a question. He stood, walked to the window, and watched the street below. How many men, Watson, would silence their soul if they believed it made them more efficient, more respected, more powerful? As the clock chimed 6, Holmes turned to me one last time. There are echoes in this city still, he said. And somewhere, someone is still listening for the perfect note. It is one thing to see justice done, quite another to feel that it has prevailed. The trial of Sir Cedric Langford was held in the lofty chambers of the Old Bailey, presided over by men in powdered wigs and guarded language. The charges were limited: unlawful medical experimentation, mismanagement of patient care, destruction of asylum records. Words like conspiracy, coercion, and neurological conditioning were never spoken in court. They belonged to the margins of the official transcripts and to the pages of my private notes. The public saw a tale of eccentric science gone too far. What Holmes and I saw was the edge of something much darker. Langford, for his part, remained impassive throughout. When asked whether he believed in what he had done, he replied only, "Belief is an obstacle to objectivity." The phrase stayed with me. In his eyes, we saw no guilt, only clarity, the terrible kind that settles upon a man who has convinced himself he is above moral arithmetic. Deletion. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my practice. And yet, I could not help but examine every one of my patients through a different lens. The banker with a nervous twitch, the schoolmaster who spoke too evenly about punishment, the clerk who swore he heard music in his dreams. I could not say what I was searching for, only that some part of me feared Langford's influence had not been confined to a single asylum or laboratory. Ideas like his, seductive, elegant, precise, tend to replicate themselves quietly beneath the surface of society. Like mold beneath wallpaper, Holmes, as ever, resumed his experiments. He played less violin. He smoked more. Once, I found him listening to an old phonograph cylinder, the same one we had retrieved from Hillgate, replaying its odd, unmelodic pulses over and over again. "What do you hear?" I asked. He replied, "That's the wrong question, Watson. The question is, what stops when this begins?" I never asked again. As I write this, I cannot help but think of Elizabeth Vernon. Her fate remains unknown. Whether she escaped, perished, or was silenced by the very forces she tried to expose, we may never know. But her act, that simple delivery of a hand-drawn image, a crude sketch of a bell and an ear, proved that not all courage announces itself. Some arrives quietly, disguised as a cry for help, in a case that manipulated sound. Inside, a small brass bell, unadorned, silent. He examined it for hours, then placed it in a drawer. He did not ring it. When I asked why, he replied, "Because I still wish to decide things for myself, Watson." And that, perhaps, was the real crime of Langford's invention. Not that it could destroy a man's will, but that it made willingness irrelevant. Only a reminder. Some bells ring not to summon or to warn, but to erase. And some silences are not peaceful, but engineered. As long as we listen, question, and doubt, there is hope. But the moment we stop, the moment we surrender choice for clarity, conscience, for control, we may find the bell already tolling, not in the street or the church tower, but deep within our own unguarded minds. It was well into November when the envelope arrived, without return address, without postage, and without sound. I found it on my writing desk at Baker Street, placed neatly beneath the corner of my ink blotter. Neither Holmes nor Mrs. Hudson claimed to have seen who delivered it. The rain had been falling in sheets that morning, and the streets outside were awash with puddles and fog, making any notion of pursuit pointless. The envelope was unsealed. Inside, a single scrap of vellum, yellowed, torn at the edge. The handwriting was familiar. It read only, "I heard the bell." But he did not ring it. His pupils tightened. "Then she's alive," I breathed. Elizabeth Vernon survived. She must have escaped Hillgate. She sent this. Holmes gave the faintest nod. Or, he said, she was allowed to send it. The implication chilled me. I tried to focus on the message itself. It refers to Langford. Bell, the one that had arrived weeks earlier. He set it between us on the table. "Do you know what makes this dangerous?" I shook my head. "It is the assumption," he said. "The assumption that something outside us has the right to command what happens inside." He tapped the bell once, gently, with his fingernail. It made no sound, but something in me flinched. "I cannot explain why," Holmes continued. "There is a signal, Watson, that bypasses logic, that does not argue or persuade, but instructs." Langford believed he could embed obedience into sensation, that a man could hear a note and not even realize he had heard it, only that he had complied. He turned the vellum over. On the back, faintly visible in rubbed graphite, were 3 concentric rings drawn around a dot, the mark from Elizabeth's original sketch. "But this message," Holmes went on, "suggests something unexpected. Resistance. She heard it," he said softly, "but she did not obey. She disobeyed." I asked. Holmes looked up, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I saw something near hope flicker behind his weary eyes. "She remembered herself," he whispered. We sat for some time in silence. At last, Holmes returned the bell to its drawer. He locked it, and with a heavy sigh, he leaned back, steepled his fingers, and said, "This case may be closed, Watson, but the experiment, theirs or ours, continues." I did not know what to say, so I simply placed the vellum among my notes and wrote beneath it, "Let it never ring again." This final note, dear reader, is not for publication. It will not appear in the Strand, nor find its way to the curious eyes of London's gossiping salons. I record it only in the privacy of my own journals, uncertain whether I shall ever have the resolve to revisit its content, but it lingers too heavily in my mind to go unwritten. It concerns a night, some weeks after the Langford affair had concluded, when Holmes and I, returning from a late supper, found ourselves halted by an unexpected sound. Not the scream of a street urchin, not the clatter of hooves or the whistle of the constable, but a bell, a single, high, metallic tone, delicate and precise, too refined for any shop door, too deliberate for a church chime, and far too brief for accident. Holmes froze. I did as well, sensing in his body the coiled tension of recognition. We turned near Draycott Lane, just 2 streets away, but when we arrived, there was no bell, no ringer, only silence. Later that night, when Holmes retired, I noticed something unusual. He did not go to his violin. He did not light his pipe. He sat by the fireplace, hands pressed tightly together, and stared into the flames. "What are you thinking?" I asked. He replied without looking at me, "I am wondering, Watson, if it is possible to hear a sound not meant for you and still feel it enter your thoughts." I offered to fetch him brandy. He declined. When I returned from my own room an hour later, I found a slip of paper left upon my writing desk. In Holmes's unmistakable hand, it read, "There are worse things than murder. Another is the illusion that it remains. Nothing more." I have, over the years, stood beside Holmes through countless cases, murders and betrayals, forgeries and flames, acts of extraordinary cruelty and elegant deception. But never before have I seen him look as he did that night, not frightened, not angry, but interrupted, as if someone or something had passed a quiet thread through his logic, just tight enough to remind him that even the most brilliant mind can be tampered with if the thread is spun from the right sound. I tell myself it was only a bell, a wind chime caught in a draught. I have avoided Draycott Lane ever since. This concludes, for now, the account of the case I have come to call the Widow of Draycott Lane. Whether the bell rings again, I do not know. Whether it ever stopped, I cannot be sure. But should I, one day, find my own memories uncertain, my thoughts disordered, or my actions no longer mine to explain, I trust Holmes will be there, not to pity me, but to listen. And if he hears the bell again, I hope he does not answer it.